de Beauvoir, Conrad essay topics, eagerly anticipated. Come and get them at the break, please. All right. We're talking about Heart of Darkness today, and I decided to make a few changes to the lecture that I initially gave on this book a couple of years ago, including a change in the title, which I decided, inspired by Fanon, to call White Skin, Black Masks. You might wonder about that title. You might wonder what it means. It could possibly mean a couple of things, depending on how you think about Conrad and depending on whether or not you think he's a racist. And I don't think it's possible to read this text anymore without engaging that question. So part of what we'll do today is engage race, engage the question of race and whether or not Conrad is in some way, shape, or form himself a racist. He's a Victorian author. It would be surprising if his views on race and culture exactly mirrored ours. It's not a very progressive period in history. So it's a question that needs to be addressed. Now, of course, we've read Fanon, and we have a sense of what this title means. I've reversed it. Is it possible, we're looking here at actually a cover from an Oxford edition of Heart of Darkness, which I've clipped and used, of an African sort of tribal mask, and one could imagine that Kurtz is behind that mask, and maybe that's one way to read the text, is that Kurtz in some way, shape, or form has quote-unquote gone native. The question is, are there racial implications for that? Another way in which one could talk about white skin, black masks is whether or not we've progressed to an extent where one could identify with black culture as a way of empowering oneself, and whether or not Conrad in some way, shape, or form has paved the way for that, notwithstanding his status as a Victorian writer and not necessarily as progressive as we are. By way of one preview, I do not regard Conrad as a racist in the sense in which many of his critics have described him as racist. I think this is a book about humanity, but it's up to you to decide how to resolve that, and it's one of the issues we'll focus on today. I don't generally say a great deal about biography. I think it's a very minimal part of what we do in Arts One, so this is all I'll say. Keep it very brief. What we do know about Conrad, I love that picture, by the way, very penetrating stare. We know that he was born in 1857. We know that he was born in Tsarist-occupied Poland. We know he died in 1924. We know he wrote a book in the last month of 1898 and the first month of 1899 called Heart of Darkness, a novella, a very influential and powerful book, a book that's been part of the canon. We'll talk about a canon a little later on, for a long time. We also know that he spoke English and spoke it very well, depending on whether or not you're a sympathetic critic. Some critics don't like the way he writes. He certainly has full command of the English language, but it wasn't his first language. Conrad would have heard English spoken in the home, but it wasn't his first language. His first language is Polish, his second language is French, his third language is English, and what's probably one of the more remarkable aspects of Conrad's life is he learns his English while sailing around the world in the British Merchant Navy. So, it's not, he didn't learn it in school, he learned it, I don't want to say on the street because he was on a boat, but he's he's a little bit like his alter ego, a little bit like Marlowe, a man of the world, a kind of everyman who really has no home in a sense and just kind of travels the seas. But he's generally considered a British author, and if you pick up, what I had as an undergrad, the Norton Anthology of English Literature, the Great Authors Edition, you'll see Conrad is on the front of that, text. So he's considered part of the British literary canon. And that's probably all we need to say in terms of biography. One of the things you'll recall Fanon saying toward the end of the text is the Negro is not any more than the white man. And what he means by this, I think, and this is what I took from Fanon and what I took from the lecture, is that racial identity is historically constructed rather than anything that's kind of biologically innate. Any of you that have taken an Anthropology 100 course or something like it would probably have learned what I learned in Anthropology 100, and that is, and I was told very early on in the course, that race is not a biological distinction. That when we talk about the race, there's one race, it's called the human race. And that when we use the term small r, we're talking usually in terms of cultural and ethnic divisions, but Fanon wants to make the point that there's only one race, it's called the human race, and that colonialism, through its structures and through the way it manipulates our psychology, turns the subaltern or the person on the receiving end of colonialism into another, into somebody who feels and thinks of themselves as inferior. So if we were to read The Tempest by Shakespeare, for example, we'd see this very clearly in the character of Caliban, who is really turned into a slave by Prospero. Prospero tells him on a daily basis, right around breakfast time, you're a slave. Thou most lying slave, pass the sugar. Right? I mean, this is his life. He's enculturated into thinking of himself as a slave. And Fanon, of course, would say that this is not innate. This is something that is deeply rooted, but it's something that can be eradicated along with colonialism. One wonders where Conrad stands on that. I think a sympathetic reading of the text would say there is only one humanity, there is only one race, it's called the human race. Now, you might say, well, that doesn't really come across super clearly in Conrad because we have this story of Charlie Marlowe who's getting closer and closer to this heart of darkness. Whatever that heart of darkness is, it's a notoriously ambiguous issue. But certainly on one level, it's Africa, the dark continent, if you will, a continent that's more or less, well, it's actually much more discovered in Conrad's time than the story suggests, but this is a work of fiction. So we've got Marlowe going up and up this river, and as he gets closer and closer to the central Congo, where he's going to find this enigmatic character named Kurtz, he's coming steadily to the conclusion that these people he sees gesticulating on the riverbank are, in fact, human beings. Now, it's possible to read this and get the impression that Marlowe's a bit of a racist, and maybe Conrad, by implication, is a bit of a racist because of the way that these people are described. But I think ultimately, beneath it all, while Marlowe sees these people as exotic, as savages, he ultimately also sees a kinship, both with Kurtz, who has become a kind of Nietzschean superhuman and transgressed some sorts of boundaries. Marlowe sees his kinship with that, but he also sees his kinship with the people gesticulating on the riverbank, if that makes sense to you. So I think we need to keep an open mind about where possibly Marlowe too, where Conrad sits in terms of race. But there's no question that race is an issue that we need to deal with when we deal with this text. And one thing we have to understand is that once upon a time, it was possible to read Conrad without necessarily engaging the issue of race. But the advent of post-colonial studies or cultural theory or whatever, these other disciplines has made that more or less impossible. So let's go back a little bit to a time when it was possible to talk about the text without introducing themes of race and culture. So, if you had studied Conrad in the 1950s or 1960s, you would possibly have lecture notes, and scribbled in their lecture notes would be things like, symbolism, that there's something symbolic going on here. You would probably look at light and darkness in terms of literary theory called, structuralism, inaugurated by somebody named Northrop Frye, who doesn't talk about race when he reads Conrad, or at least not very much. You would talk about the mythological. You've read your Freud. You'd certainly see the Freudian overtones. If you'd read Jung, you'd see Jungian overtones. We didn't read Jung. I won't say much more about that. Suffice it to say that modern psychoanalytic theories might change the way that we read the text. We might see it as a journey, but what kind of journey? Well, on the literal level, of course, it's a journey from the great metropolis of London, out from the Thames, out onto the sea, and down, of course, to the mighty Congo River and into the heart of Africa. So on one level, a literal journey. On another level, of course, a figurative journey. Maybe a journey backward in time, a journey back to the primordial age, a journey back to the beginning of the human species. It sometimes comes across that way. It's one way to read the text. But also a downward journey, a journey down below what we know of the self and into the unconscious, into repressed desires. What is it that Kurtz is doing after all? The horror of the horror. What is this final verdict that he's rendered on his life? The text is notoriously vague about that. It's good reading because it's notoriously vague. If he said the horror, and then told us what he was talking about, it would be a much less interesting text. So we're left to try to figure that out. But presumably he's done some stuff that he thinks go beyond what's lawful in the ordinary sense, that he's perhaps engaged in some kind of abominable rites. He's probably killed some people. We don't know precisely what he's done. We've seen the movie Apocalypse Now, and we see where that movie goes and its companion to this text. And I think the movie picks up on some of those themes as well in a fairly obvious way. But, there was a time when you could have read this text without necessarily talking about race, is the simple point I want to make. To push this a little bit further, one of the things that has been said of Conrad in post-colonial, that's hard to say, it's hard to wrap your head around, post-colonial readings, is the ambiguities of civilization. That modernism or modernity or progress is a kind of double-edged sword. It's not all sweetness and light. with apologies to the Enlightenment philosophers who we'll talk about in this lecture. It's not necessarily all sweetness and light. Maybe something's wrong here. One of the things the text seems to address is the hypocrisies of the West. And in particular, the hypocrisy is bound up with something called imperialism. Now, one thing we will notice about Conrad right off the bat, well, two things. One, this is a text that's talking about the Belgian Congo at a time in which colonialism was, getting into one of its ugliest and most kind of rapacious phases. It's a particularly nasty type of colonialism. It's a one-man colonialism by a guy named Leopold II who decided that his European countries scrambled for empire. He wanted one of his own. Right? So we know that it's about that. We know that Conrad was aware of that. We know that Conrad went to the Congo and that he's reflecting back on his own experiences to some extent in writing this text. So that's one thing we know. We also know that regardless of what the critics we're about to look at say about Conrad, he's not approving of it. He doesn't approve of what he's seeing in the Congo. At least he doesn't appear to be pro-imperialism. Now, it has been suggested that Conrad regards Belgian imperialism as bad and may therefore vindicate the British model. That's a possibility, and that makes him less enlightened than some of us might like to see him. But I'll leave that to you to decide on the basis of your readings. One thing that you will notice in the first 10 or so pages of the text is that he makes a number of sardonic asides about colonialism. For example, he refers to it as, quote unquote, the noble cause. Now, when he says noble cause, he's being ironic. He doesn't mean it's noble at all. Or when he talks about the glorious affair, quote unquote, he doesn't mean that. He's being ironic. And then when somebody is telling him about what he'll find in the Belgian Congo, and that they're trying to convince him that it's essentially a philanthropic enterprise, Marlowe says, I ventured to hint that the company was run for profit. So if you're looking for righteous indignation, you're not going to find it. If you're looking for outright anger, you're not going to find it. If you're looking for Marlowe to scream and say this is unacceptable as he enters the grove of death in this text, you're not going to find it. It's not that kind of a text. It's more oblique than that. It's more sardonic than that. It's more ironic than that. So be aware of that as you're reading the text, that Conrad doesn't necessarily, via Marlowe, engage in a kind of righteous indignation, even if you're very angry at what you're reading about. Even if Conrad himself is, even if Marlowe is, he's not conveying it that way. And remember, there's something interesting going on in terms of the narrative structure of the text as well, but we'll leave that to the essay topics. But more recent criticism, by which I mean really 1970s onward for sure, it's impossible now, I think, to go back before time. It's impossible to roll back the clock and talk about this text as if it's got nothing to do with race and culture. It's probably the dominant theme. To pick up a text like Conrad's Heart of Darkness, we immediately think about it, and we've been alerted to thinking about it in post-colonial studies in racial terms. The way that we now pick up Shakespeare's Tempest, written in 1611, and read about it in racial terms, when it was not necessarily written in that sense. Although I would argue, if I were lecturing on the Tempest, that Shakespeare is a critic of colonial policy, just as I think Conrad is. Okay, so it's impossible, however, to see these texts in any other light now, I think. I mean, we see these other interpretations as well. I don't want to be misleading, but it's hard to avoid talking about race and culture as we read the text, and nor should we, arguably. Because it's also impossible to ignore this particular criticism, which is a very sharp one, a very pointed one. And it's made by a Nigerian author named Chinua Achebe, who's best known for a novel called Things Fall Apart, which is a line from a poem. You know the poem, but just satisfy me that you know the poem. Could somebody tell me what poem that comes from? It's a nice modernist poem by an Irish writer in honor of, what is today? Why am I not wearing green? I forgot. In honor of St. Paddy's Day. Who is that writer? And what is that poem? The Second Coming. So things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, etc., etc., etc. And of course, Achebe wants to take that line and use it for his text. And the thing that falls apart in his novel is Nigerian life, Nigerian tribal life as traditionally understood. So he's a novelist, an important novelist in his own right. Achebe himself has been part of the Arts One canon, that is to say its list of sacred texts, because that's really what a canon is. Right? It's a list of sacred texts. What counts as canonical and what doesn't is a huge issue. And Achebe wades into that issue, and he wants to take on Conrad. And he wants to say that there's something wrong with Conrad, that he's a racist, and we shouldn't be reading racist authors. I read Achabi myself in Arts 1 when I was an Arts 1 student back in the previous century at some point. So Achabi says, in answer to this question, is Conrad a racist? The short answer is yes for Achabi. He's a racist. And he made this claim in a speech in 1975 at the University of Massachusetts. But he has reasons for making his claims, and you've read the text, and you can decide whether or not his objections to Conrad resonate with your own. There are particular passages in the text that he directs us toward, which ultimately leads him to this claim, that Africa in the hands of Conrad is a foil to Europe, a place of negations, that Europeans set up the standard, the white standard of what is and what is good and what is spiritual grace, and that Africa is seen as a kind of insufficient approximation of that. It's a negation. It's something that we are not. In comparison with which Europe's own state of spiritual grace will be manifest. So this is a kind of pro-European text. It's all about advancing the cultural values of the white man and diminishing Africans as a result. Achabi also makes the claim that the very humanity of black people is called into question. And then he goes on to say that Conrad's book should not be read, that you should not read Conrad's book. Now, I wonder how you feel about that as Arts 1 students who are participating in a course that in many respects is canonical, but doesn't slavishly adhere to to texts that have been considered canonical in the past. Yes, we read our Plato's Republic, but we read other things as well that would not necessarily be considered part of the canon. Now, Achabi's telling us what should and shouldn't be on the canon. He's speaking to humanities courses like our own, to literature courses, to university courses in general, and saying it's a disgrace that we read Conrad because the text is so steeped in racism. Now, one thing one might say to Achabi is, well, hang on a minute. What about that very powerful scene in the novel, which we're going to read together in this lecture, in which Marlowe enters the inferno, enters what is called in literary criticism the grove of death. He sees people dying. He sees something that eerily prefigures something called the Holocaust. He sees it, he gets it, he sees the scale of the death and the destruction. And it's very powerfully rendered. And so some would say to Achabi, well, what about that? Doesn't that show that Conrad has some sensitivity to these matters? And doesn't he ultimately see these Africans as human in spite of these, in spite of the impediments that Marlowe is saying exist? Because Marlowe does ultimately recognize he's dealing with human beings here. And I think Achabi would say bleeding heart liberal sentimentality. That ultimately Conrad is a quote-unquote bloody racist and cannot be redeemed, and that you shouldn't read him. So you should decide for yourself. It's too late now anyways, you've read it. Or am I being generous in saying you've read it? It's too late now because we hope you've read it. And it's worth mentioning another critic, couldn't resist the wordplay, sorry, what Said said. There's one other critic. There are many critics of Conrad, but these are two modern critics that are particularly interesting and particularly influential authors. Edward Said is a very important modern Lebanese-born Palestinian intellectual who has written a number of very important books, probably the best known of which, 1978, is his text called Orientalism, and he weighs in on this debate as well. And he's a little bit more restrained than Achabi, and it's probably, especially in the sense that he doesn't tell us that we shouldn't read Conrad. He says it's okay to read him. He doesn't want to remove anybody from the canon. But he does say this about Conrad. He says that Conrad's tragic limitation is that even though he could see clearly that on one level imperialism was essentially pure dominance and land grabbing, right? This clearly comes through in the text. He could not then conclude that imperialism, he couldn't take the next step. He couldn't then conclude that imperialism had to end so that the natives could lead lives free from European domination. He could not grant them their freedom. So what Said is saying is that the novel has failed. It's failed not as a novel. This isn't an argument about, plot structure. It's not an argument about the literary merits of the text, but it's failed politically. Now, you might ask yourself whether novels, whether works of art, works of fiction are obligated to say anything politically. But Said says they are. And I guess cultural studies say they are. And so what we've done here is we've taken a text which is essentially a work of art, and we said there is no such thing as art for art's sake. Everything has a kind of political and cultural implication. And he renders a very negative judgment on Conrad's text as well, but at least according to Said, we're still allowed to read it. He doesn't say we can't read it. Now, here's a counter-argument. It comes exclusively from a guy named David Denby, who is a writer for The New Yorker, and he's interesting because he's kind of a former Arts 1 student, although he never took Arts 1. He did, however, take a course at Columbia University called the Great Books course, which is quite similar to Arts 1. A much more famous course. It's been around longer than Arts 1, so I can't stand here and tell you they modeled their course on us. It'd be nice if I could. And he's written a book called Great Books, in which he's reflected on a number of different authors, including Conrad. And it's very interesting reading. And I've read his essay on Conrad and many other things beside. And he goes into great detail about how these authors were presented by his instructor, a guy named Shapiro, and how the class engaged those authors and how they debated those authors and so on. So it's quite interesting reading. And this is what he says in defense of you, in defense of Arts 1, in defense of the canon, in defense of, you know, we don't just read the canon, but some of the stuff we read. He wants to make us feel better about having read Conrad. In fact, he thinks that it's a shame that anybody would say we shouldn't. This is what he said about Achebe's 1975 speech. He called it an act of rhetorical violence. He said it's beneath him to make the kinds of claims he makes, and that his attack on Conrad is one-sided and partial and isn't open-minded enough to see that Conrad is, in fact, on a kind of profound level, recognizing the humanity of the African other. And that he's a writer, he's an artist, he's not under any obligation to change the world. In fact, however, Conrad is one of the few people that is writing about what's going on in the Belgian Congo at the turn of, I was going to say the turn of the previous century, but it would be 2 previous centuries. So at the turn of the century in 1899. And he says this of Said: blaming writers for what they fail to write about is a bizarrely wrong-headed or even malicious way of reading them. You know, you failed to write about something. We have Charlie Marlowe going up the Congo and watching watching Africans gesticulating on the riverbank and not understanding what they're saying, right? The way that Prospero and Miranda are looking at Caliban when they arrive on his island, and they claim that he can't even speak. They say that he gabbles like a thing most brutish. It's the same reaction, similar kind of reaction. Yeah, that's happening, but, you know, I guess what Demby is saying is, what does Said want Conrad to write about? Does he want Marlowe to get out of the boat, walk up the riverbank, and start a conversation? Would that be realistic? Would that be consistent with the story? Would that be consistent with the whole sense or the whole intention of the novel? And I think it's a reasonable counter-criticism to both Said and Achebe. Now, my point is not to say, hey, Achebe, you're out to lunch, and Said, you're out to lunch. My point is that these criticisms exist, and you need to be aware of them. But at the end of the day, obviously, I have decided that it's okay to read Conrad, or I wouldn't have suggested it for the reading list, and my colleagues wouldn't have accepted it. So you can go to bed tonight feeling guilt-free. The guilt, you know, the burden is ours, not yours. But if you strongly object to reading these texts, you know, you could sort of be you could conscientiously object to talking about Conrad in the seminar. Another point I would make is if not Conrad, then who? And what I mean by that is that Conrad is actually writing about, although fictionalized, he's actually writing about what's going on in the Belgian Congo when virtually nobody else is. Now, there is a famous well, I shouldn't say famous, there is a concerted and one of the first major modern humanitarian movements against what's going on in the Congo. This is real, and this is one of the reasons that Conrad knows about it. But other than that, there really aren't any, you know, nobody's really speaking up for the Africans, even if they're not fully understanding who they are. And even if they're appropriating who they are in some important ways, at least there's a kind of a voice there. So look, for example, at what one writer has said about this. He says the Victorian age was a golden age of letters and diaries. And it often seems as if every visitor or official in the Congo kept a voluminous journal. One problem, of course, is that nearly all of this vast river of words is by Europeans or Americans. So Conrad's clearly in that category. There was no written language in the Congo when Europeans first arrived, and this inevitably skewed the way that history was recorded. Instead of African voices from this time, there is largely a silence. So while the European and American voices aren't necessarily the authentic voices that we would like to hear in 1899, at least they're voices. At least we're hearing about what's going on. And there's no question that it had some influence, that these writings had some influence in mitigating what was happening there. And that comment comes from a guy named Adam Hochschild, who looks like this. And he's written a book called King Leopold's Ghost, which is about the Belgian Congo. It's a historical text, very interesting text, and it's got some of those same gruesome photos that you see in the back of your Broadview edition of Heart of Darkness. It gives me an opportunity to turn to the sort of political side of Conrad's vision. And I'm not turning to the political side of Conrad's vision because I happen to be a political scientist. That's an accident, he said, lying. But also because it's there, that there is a sort of political aspect to this. And I've subtitled this part of the lecture, Apocalypse Then and Now, by way of bringing the Francis Ford Coppola film, and a very famous film about Vietnam, that many of you might not have known is actually based on Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which didn't happen in Vietnam, but in the Belgian Congo. And, let's just look at one of the things that Hochschild says about his encounter with Conrad's Heart of Darkness. He says in this text, and I've drawn some of the inspiration for this lecture on Hochschild's book, he says, "I knew almost nothing about the history of the Congo until a few year ago. Then it occurred to me that, like millions of other people, I had read something about that time and place after all." Sorry, I keep hitting the mic here. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. However, with my college lecture notes on the novel filled with scribbles about Freudian overtones, he's obviously old because he's not talking about race, Freudian overtones, mythic echoes, and inward vision, I had mentally filed away the book under fiction, not fact. So it's just something I'd read in college and enjoyed. Didn't realize it had an actual connection to the real world. And then we have this guy named Jonathan. Now, one of the wonderful things about the internet is it's empowered all of us to have points of view on this. And I found this a couple of years ago, and I enjoyed reading it, so I'll read it to you. This is what Jonathan says about the text. He says, "I watched a video on the Congo Free State in English class and was appalled at I don't know whether this is college or high school, and I was appalled at the gory details of torture and the use of fear to break the Congo people. No, this video wasn't shown randomly." I don't know what that means. What do we mean when we say randomly? I have no idea anymore. My kids say it drives me nuts. But anyway, the video wasn't shown randomly. We just read The Heart of Darkness, a book that depicts the journey of a dude, I can't make this stuff up, named Marlowe, and his journey up a nameless river in Africa, all the while seeing the horrors of the European occupation. So why is it that I learned about King Leopold in an English class and not in world history? The situation reminded me of a scene in Hotel Rwanda. Anybody seen that film? I've actually never seen it, so I don't know how accurate it is. When some guy from the UN is telling Don Cheadle, main character, that the UN was pulling out and wasn't going to stop the mass killings. He said something along the lines of, "The world doesn't care about you, and their eyes you're nothing." Not an exact quote. Is the lack of information in textbooks about the exploitation of the Congo proof of that? Okay, so again, somebody who's twigging, somebody who's reading Conrad in a modern context, and twigging that, hey, this has real relevance, both to the history of Africa then, but the history of Africa today. Because if you know anything about what is now called the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of many oxymorons that I enjoy, the Democratic Republic of Congo is not very democratic. It's not really a republic. But that's what it's called today. It's a massive country. I don't know if you know this, the Congo is slightly smaller than Western Europe. It's a very big country. If you know anything, you know that the eastern part of the Belgian Congo is in complete chaos. I just called it the Belgian Congo. That's a slip back to earlier times. The Congo, the DRC. And that it's been, at least for the last 5 years, a war zone. And estimates are that 4 to 5 million people have died in the last 5 years alone as a direct result of violence in the eastern part of the country. And that violence is pretty horrific. Not that we distinguish between different types of violence, but if you look at the back of your book, you'll see people getting their hands cut off. That's going on today as we speak in the Congo. Rape is being used as an instrument of war, a widespread tool of war in the eastern part of the Congo and other parts of Africa as well. So the really nasty stuff that we're hearing about in 1899 has been resolved by not being resolved. The Congo is still what we would in political science terms call a zone of conflict, where nobody wants to be, and the state has more or less ceased to function. In fact, the only real institutional presence in many parts of Africa today, and especially in the eastern part of the Congo, are multinational corporations. You can find them anywhere. You can find them anywhere. And most of the multinationals you'll find in the eastern part of the Congo, which is very rich in natural resources, are Belgian. Which is not all that surprising to me because I teach a course on multinational corporations, and multinational corporations tend to go and tend to gravitate to areas of previous direct colonial control. So in terms of the politics, not much has changed. So here's a quick and dirty history of the Congo in Conrad's day, the Congo Free State as it was eventually called. We don't really need to dwell on this because it's in your reading. It's in your novel, essays to this, and these kinds of facts are in there. What is interesting is that Conrad calls it, quote, the vilest scramble for loot that ever disfigured the history of human consciousness, unquote. Now, I don't know how JB can read that and not realize that Conrad is condemning what's going on. The vilest scramble for loot that ever disfigured the history of human consciousness. So pretty negative verdict on what's going on there. But now again, it's possible that Conrad might look at British imperialism and see it as superior, so it doesn't necessarily mean that he hasn't got some problematic views as well. So that's the Congo then. And I'm really not going to pause long on this because, as I say, your text has this sort of information in it, so we're going to switch to the Congo now. And the Congo now looks like this. Well, it still looks exactly like it did 100 years ago. It's going to take a long time for it to look any different. That's what it looks like in isolation from the rest of the continent of Africa. So what you see here, I don't have a laser pointer, unfortunately, but on your left-hand side, you see this very narrow strip of land. And that's actually about 30 or 40 miles. It must be more than that. It's a fair distance across. But that's the mouth of the Congo River, which, if you could see it, coils into the heart of the Congo, rather like a snake, and which is what, in fact, Marlowe tells us in the text. Just a quick and dirty history of the modern politics of the Congo. You'd have to be living under a rock not to know about the Rwandan Civil War, which occurs from 1990 to 93. It's difficult to date it because, in some ways, the civil war in Rwanda has never really ended, but it's hostilities officially terminated in 1993, just before the genocide, where Hutu-led militias attempted to liquidate the Tutsi population. Now, why is this relevant to the Congo? Because, again, I can't show you without a pointer, but on the right-hand side, I'll show you in a second on a separate screen, Rwanda is up against the eastern border of the Congo. And, of course, not surprisingly, the genocide in Rwanda caused a massive refugee exodus. And, of course, Tutsis in particular were fleeing the Hutu, but the Hutu were also fleeing justice when the Rwandan regime was stabilized. And so Hutu militias moved into the eastern parts of the Congo and continue to this day, right up until this actual minute, they continue to try to undermine the politics in Rwanda. Again, it's a zone of conflict where nobody's really in control. So this creates a refugee crisis in East Zaire, as it was then known. It's had a few name changes over the years. As I said, it's now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo, but in the 1980s and 90s, early 90s, it was known as Zaire. In 1997, its government, the government of Mobutu Sese Seko, as he called himself, was toppled. I say as he called himself, as he renamed himself after he toppled the previous government. So Mobutu was a military commander who seized power in 1965 by assassinating the previous president, Lubumba. And that's Mobutu there. And his government was toppled in 1997. One of the reasons his government was toppled is the Cold War ended. And if you know anything about the Cold War, you know that all conflicts in the world were filtered through that prism of East-West relations. And once the Cold War ended, the U.S. had no interest in propping up the Mobutu regime anymore, so they just more or less let him go, knowing that his government would fall. His government did fall. He was replaced by a guy named Laurent Kabila. That's him there. He was, of course, assassinated in 2001, and the current president of the Congo is his son, Joseph Kabila. And in 2002, the Congo was officially at peace, but as I say, the eastern part of the Congo is the single most war-torn area of the world today. And one of the major reasons for this is that we've got is interference from other states. So what we have is a country with a a history of continual interference from outside. Interference by the Belgians, interference by Europeans, interference by multinational corporations, interference by army factions, interference by neighboring states, all of whom are scrambling for its resources. So in some senses, nothing's really changed. In Heart of Darkness, we're talking about ivory and rubber. Today we're talking about oil, tungsten, tin, and a whole range of base metals and precious metals, some of which you would never even have heard of, but they're very valuable. And that scramble for loot that Conrad talked about is still going on today. Only the players have changed. And if you pay any attention to the conflict and look on the you look on web pages, you'll find some really horrific and gruesome images of children being burned alive, of the after effects of the use of rape, the systematic use of rape as an instrument of war. The details of this become so graphic that I couldn't even bring myself to tell you what's happening. But some of these atrocities continue to include the use of the cutting off of hands, and of course those are some of the more graphic images you'll see in the text that we've given you. So that's where things stand today. Just one more image for you, and this is a map of Africa as a whole. It's been shrunk to fit on the page. One of the reasons I show you this is I want you to have a sense of where the Congo sits in terms of its neighbors, but also because you'll recall that Marlowe tells us that when he's a kid, he sees a map of Africa, and he sees all these different colors. And I know when I was a kid, in trying hard not to fail grade 8 socials, I had to go back for a couple of weeks in the summer, so I shouldn't have told you that. But anyway, I remember looking at a map of Africa and thinking, wow, look at all those colors. What a fascinating place. I'd love to go there one day. Right. Now, of course, it's even more divided than it was in Conrad's day, because the political divisions of Africa, the lines drawn on this map are drawn more or less along ethnic and linguistic lines. And so Africa is a place that's intensely diverse in terms of ethnicities, and this isn't even close to capturing that. If you were to draw a perfect map along ethnic and linguistic lines and divisions, it would be much more divided than it even is here. So that's what Africa looks like, and a lot of these boundaries, of course, are a function of a pre-colonial involvement. So Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe are involved indirectly and directly in the politics of the DRC today. So is Uganda, so is Rwanda. And the country is really literally encircled by turmoil. I don't know if you're following the news, but there's a terrible civil war going on in the Central African Republic as we speak. Mass atrocities. A story of Muslims taking refuge in a church and being systematically murdered by Christian rebels. I don't know if you're following this in the news. And there were even allegations of cannibalism as we speak going on in the Central African Republic. So in some ways, the politics really haven't changed much at all. Hence the title, Apocalypse Then and Now. And I have I'll pass on showing you the grisly images. You can, if you're interested, you can follow up and do some research of your own. But suffice it to say that it's pretty dramatic and ugly stuff. But is this the Congo of the Heart of Darkness, I guess, is the question we need to ask ourselves. Is this primarily a political text? Or is it also a work of art? And I guess you could say, well, what exactly is this Heart of Darkness? It operates at so many different levels. It's got a kind of, as we said earlier, there's a literal business to it. There's a figurative part to it. That's just something you need to try to sort of work through on your own. One thing for sure, and John's going to laugh at this because we had a meeting that discussed this, I don't think you can read this text without talking about light and darkness. It's like going to Mozart's Magic Flute and seeing it performed and not coming away with the impression that it's somehow about light and darkness. You've got the Queen of the Night. You've got Zoroaster in his Temple of Light. How can one escape those images? So those images are everywhere. The question is, what do we do with them? What is Conrad doing with them? Is it straightforward? Is it like Mozart's Magic Flute, i.e., light stands for good, dark stands for black, Europeans light, white, ergo good, Africans black-skinned, black in the heart? So is it really that simple that it's the heart of darkness is the African heart that's beating, this primitive African heart that isn't civilized and can't be civilized? Is that what Conrad's saying? I doubt it very much. I think the evidence is strongly against that reading. But it's one possible way of looking at it. Now, I think that as we begin to read the text, we don't have to get very far into the text to see that Conrad is doing something quite interesting with these images of light and dark. He's problematizing them, right? He's playing around with this idea. Now, again, straightforwardly, you've all heard of the Enlightenment. We heard about the Enlightenment in the context of Rousseau. We heard about the Enlightenment in the context of the French Revolution. And Paine is very much an Enlightenment thinker. The idea that the light of reason will be shed in all aspects of human life, and they will eventually know everything there is to know. And it's all very unproblematic. It's all very exciting. It's really just a matter of getting around to it. That we will one day understand everything. Very straightforward. Now, you'll know that Rousseau doesn't really buy into this. You'll remember from Rousseau that he's kind of the bad boy of the French Enlightenment. L'enfant terrible of the French Enlightenment, right? He even, I won't say any more than that, but he's a bad boy. Rousseau is a bad boy. And he starts to rain on that parade. My question for you is Conrad also raining on that parade? And I think the answer is yes. He's raining on the parade. He's very much not an optimistic writer. He's kind of like the Morrissey of Victorian fiction, right, in that sense. In other words, he's a modernist. He's a modernist writer, and we'll talk about that in a second because we need to. So you could say light stands for enlightenment. Duh, right? Light, enlightenment. The light bulb goes off. Plato, right? We intuit things with our brain. Versus the cave, which is dark, which is ignorant. So the heart of darkness is like a cave, and there's something black going on there, and it's not good. But Conrad's actually subverting that imagery. He's certainly playing around with it. So, for example, if you look at let's actually look at the text on page 69. To set the scene here, it's twilight, it's evening, and they're waiting to catch the morning tide, right? They're on their way out somewhere, and Marlowe's going to tell a story. But look at the language that's being used here and the way they're playing around with light. In the middle of the page, the sun set, the dust fell on. By the way, you brought your books, right? Okay. The sun set, the dust fell on the stream, and lights began to appear along the shore. The Chapman Lighthouse, a three-legged thing erect on a mudflat, shone strongly. Lights of ships move in the fairway, a great stir of lights going up and down, lots and lots of lights. And farther west on the upper reaches, the place of the monstrous town. Not, good old London town, but the monstrous town. Monstrous. Reminiscent of an earlier Artsman theme. Now monstrous, of course, can mean big, but it also means something negative here. Was still marked ominously on the sky, a brooding gloom in lurid sunshine. Brooding gloom in sunshine. You need new glasses. A lurid glare under the stars. And this also, said Marlowe suddenly, has been one of the dark places of the earth. So if you're wondering, hey, where is this heart of darkness? Oh, is it just Africa? No, this also has been one of the dark places of the earth. And one wonders whether it isn't still one of the darkest. Right? There's ambiguity here for sure. Look at the way London is described. It's not overwhelmingly positive. In fact, it's not positive at all. Very negative descriptions. Right? This great metropolis. Not so great. We have allusions to the germs of empire, right? The notion that what's going on is somehow analogous to diseases. And of course, when it comes to Brussels, it's one of the most negative descriptions of a European city you'll ever read anywhere. The sepulchral city is how it's described, the city of the dead. I was so influenced by Conrad that as I traveled around Europe on an interrail pass in the 1980s, I avoided Belgium. I don't want to go there. It's the sepulchral place. It's not a place I want to hang out. As a matter of fact, Belgium, if you travel a lot through Europe, it's one of those places you're constantly going through. So it's possible to go through Belgium 20 times like I did and never stop there. So Conrad may be a little bit reluctant to go to Belgium. So he does have an influence on us. So he begins to play around with his imagery of light and dark. And he begins to kind of potentially subvert it. Go back here. What is going on? Why am I losing text? Okay, hang on. Something went badly wrong here. No clear sense of direction. I've just lost all of my slides and only have the titles, and I don't know which is back and which is forth. So we're going to have a musical interlude here. Oh, I know what's happened. I've become unplugged. That was strange. Why would there be anything there? Oh, what am I doing? That doesn't matter. So stop worrying about that. We're working on this. So I don't know what's happened. Yeah, here we go. Okay, good. Phew. That was weird. No sense of direction. So Conrad subverts these motifs. Africa, a place of nature or natural darkness. Sure, that makes sense, right? If you think about the dark continent, if you think you're steaming up a river and you don't know what's behind the bushes and you hear strange noises and you don't know what a hippopotamus is, you've never seen one, you don't know what else is in the water. But there's also, I would argue, a more sinister kind of darkness in this text, and it's more often and more consistently connected to Europe than it is to Africa. And that's the darkness of imperialism. Or not necessarily even imperialism, the darkness of modern technical rationality and the ways in which it's capable of going badly. And I really think it all comes together in that Grove of Death scene, where the implications, the full horror of what's going on there really crystallizes, I think, in Marlowe's mind when he sees somebody dying and recognizes that even if I gave this guy food, he'd still die. He's past the point of no return. So I think one of the ways that I would challenge you to read this novel is to suspend what you think you know about images of light and dark, and maybe even reverse them. Maybe even start to think that white is dark and bad, and that dark is not necessarily bad. Right? For example, when Brussels is called the sepulchral city, what we're being told is that it's white on the outside, but dead on the inside. You know, woe unto ye, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, all, says Jesus in Matthew. You are like a whited sepulcher, meaning you're like a tomb. You're white and pristine and clean on the outside, but inside you're dead and you're black. There's a moral decay going on inside you. And, you know, Conrad's obviously aware of that, that parable or that reference point when he calls Brussels the sepulchral city. So it's a nice kind of reversal of images there. Now, it's very difficult. First of all, I'm a political scientist. I'm not an English professor. And it's also very difficult in a very short lecture to give you anything other than a quick and dirty and possibly somewhat glib assessment of what literary modernism is all about. But I'll try to give you a sense, a working sense, so that we can at least situate Conrad within a kind of mode and style of writing. How many of you have read any T.S. Eliot in high school? Right? What if you Love Song of Jail from Prufrock, something like that? Yeah? Really uplifting? Yeah. Makes you want to stick your head in an oven when you're done? No? That kind of uplifting. Do I Dare to Eat a Peach? I mean, here's a poem about a guy that can't even bring himself to eat soft fruit. He's so paralyzed by doubt. That's modernism. Right? And modernism, we lived in this world of certainties, and along comes Nietzsche and says, God is dead. He actually said it in German, but he said it. He's not the first one to say it, but he said it so authoritatively in 1882 in The Gay Science that people thought, oh, wow, God's dead. What do we do now? Right? God is dead. In other words, moral absolutes are gone. Now, you saw in Wollstonecraft that Wollstonecraft is looking for, you remember that she's looking for moral absolutes. She wants to try to frame her argument around some sense of moral absolutes, right? Plato is looking for moral absolutes. He's looking for something called the good. And Genesis, or rather the Bible that it's embedded in, is looking for moral absolutes. It's looking for, the commands of God. And Hobbes gives up on moral absolutes. He says, no, I can't have moral absolutes. They don't exist, so I'll settle for conditional precepts. So Hobbes, in that sense, is quite modern. But what we have in modernism is a pervasive sense of anxiety more than anything else. Is God dead? Can we be good without God? That question might strike us as ridiculous, because maybe many of you go around being good on a daily basis without necessarily thinking about or committing yourself to the idea of God. But in the time period in which in the time period in which Conrad is writing, this is a new idea, right? And it really rocks the faith of an entire literary generation. Well, God is dead. If God is dead, if Nietzsche is right, how are we going to deal with this? Now, you could say that indirectly, Conrad is paying homage to this by having Kurtz by having someone say, Mr. Kurtz, he dead. Because Kurtz sets himself up as a god and also dies. Right? And that he becomes deflated. And Marlowe can't decide, do I hate this guy? Do I like this guy? Can I identify with this guy? Again, there are really no moral absolutes here. How many times are we told in this text, how many times are we told by Marlowe that I am, I'm not sure? And the omniscient narrator, the frame narrator, says, early in the text, and Marlowe began another one of his inconclusive stories. Marlowe tells inconclusive stories. Oh, he spins a great yarn, but the stories are inconclusive. We're not really sure what to make of it morally. So we're operating here in a kind of moral ambiguity. We don't know what's right. We don't know what's wrong. We have a sense that Kurtz has done some heavy stuff and may well have gone well beyond what's acceptable. But in a world in which there are no rights and wrongs, how does one judge Kurtz if we're just, if we don't really have any standard left if God is dead? And of course, the reason I have Eliot 1925 is it's the epigram, one of the epigrams on the poem, The Hollow Man, of course. It begins with this line, Mr. Kurtz, he dead. Now you know where it came from if you didn't already. So what we have here is a kind of sense of crisis. Now you might find that hard to identify with, because I could say to you, I guarantee you, if I came in today and suddenly screamed, God is dead, it might offend some of you. And I don't necessarily have to believe it, but I don't think you'd go, oh, jeez. I don't think you'd freak out. I don't think you'd be shattered. I don't think you'd say, should I eat a peach? Right? Should I take the kind of Eliot response? Is anything true? Should I go out and write an even more pessimistic poem called The Wasteland? Right? I don't know what to, but in Conrad's generation, you have to understand that this sense of moral absolutes was so powerful. And now we've got this new world, this modern world. We've got writers like these guys, Marx, Freud, and Darwin coming along, and in their, each in their own ways, telling us directly or indirectly that, hey, there is no God, or that the world isn't what you think it is, or that there are laws and structures that transcend who you are, and that there's this thing called the id and the ego. Or that there are these economic laws that push us in certain directions, or that we're evolving in spite of ourselves. And that these forces are beyond our control or mysterious, right? The world isn't quite the world we thought it was. It's a very dislocating place. And to all this comes Nietzsche and says God is dead. What Nietzsche is saying when he says God is dead is there are no more moral absolutes. That's the way it's affecting writing. And so modernist writing, modernist fiction, modernist poetry is characterized by that sense of anxiety and crisis that you might find interesting. Because maybe you're not modernist. Maybe you're postmodernists who actually like the idea that there are no moral absolutes. Very different kind of, we might be very different temperamentally from where Conrad's coming from. A little bit more and then we'll break. And this is the source for this very cribbed version of what constitutes the sort of core feeling of modernism. So a little bit more on that, and then we'll break. No clear sense of direction. We're back to that. So in writing and in art, and maybe even in philosophy, we have experimentation, we have fragmentation, we have ambiguity, moral ambiguity. Is life meaningful? Is life purposeful? Or even a life without objective meaning and purpose, what a type of Russian writing is calling nihilism. We see this in Dostoevsky. We see this in Conrad. We certainly see this in the case of Marlowe. Again, he's telling inconclusive stories. We don't really know where Marlowe fits into all this. And we have a lot of emphasis on things that we would call absurd. Like we don't really know the meaning of things. There's stuff going on here and we're not quite able to wrap our head around it. There's a kind of sense of almost existential nausea as we navigate this text, right? That we're just not sure why we're here. Why do we exist? What is the meaning of life? Is life meaningless? Should we just kill ourselves? That kind of stuff. Now, I don't think anybody in this text is contemplating killing themselves, although Marlowe's contemplating killing Kurtz, right? But there's a sense in which, we seem to be walking around without any clear sense of where we're going. It's almost like we're figuratively journeying into a kind of a darkness, right? We're not sure if there's any light here. Is there any light at the end of this? Can't say tunnel. Is there any light at the end of this river? Or is it just Kurtz, this demented madman inside his little compound? And one of the things that defines this period, and we'll talk about this more after the break, is an increasing reliance on technology. The world, we're progressing, right? Now remember what Rousseau says about progress? He says that every advancement is actually, in fact, a retrograde move. That every advancement in appearance toward the improvement of the species is, in fact, a step backward. And one wonders whether technology can be viewed the same way, right? That we have, on the one hand, we have the steamship, that's great. We have the railroad, that's great. We have electricity, I think, I'm not sure, about 1899, whatever. Just speaking in terms of examples, we have all of these technological developments, and many more wonderful things are coming, nuclear weapons, technologies, all of these technologies, and I said wonderful in an ironic way, because that's the point. The point is the technology itself is just that. It's just technology. What are we going to do with it? How are we going to use it? Is it, as we go into the break, we can think about this, the same technology that allows us to navigate the world, to circumnavigate the world, to see the world, to enjoy the world, is also the same technology that allows us to enslave it. Right? We're talking about ships loaded with rubber and ivory arriving in the ports of Belgium on a weekly basis. Right? That's all been made possible by modern technology. But the possibilities of that technology cut in a couple of different directions. It's not necessarily good. So, with the advent of all of these things, and by the time we get to Elliot, the motor car, and so on, it's not necessarily the case that these are positive things. And I think that is really right at the heart of the modernist discourse, this sense of anxiety and crisis, and can we be good without God, and what does all this stuff mean, and where are we going? And then, of course, in the middle of it all, we have this terrible thing called the First World War, which really rocks everybody's confidence. Right? So we'll just leave it at that, and we'll break until a little after 2:10, and then we'll reconvene. Thank you. Just one more point on this slide, and then we'll move on, out of fear that you're going to think the title of this slide might be the title of the lecture. Is part of the darkness, or is one way of understanding the darkness, and certainly the way I tend to understand at least part of this story, is the darkness that sits at the heart of the modern story of reason and rationality. In other words, is it a function of this kind of modernistic pessimism that is characterizing the age? So in that sense, Conrad is going to be a product of his times. He's going to be a product of this kind of generalized anxiety and this phase that we now retroactively call modernist writing. Now, in 1944, there's a book published called The Dialectic of Enlightenment, or Dialectic of Enlightenment, by a couple of German writers, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. No particular reason that you should know a lot about that book. I'm going to talk a little bit about that book. It's a complicated, difficult book. And it's really not directly related to Conrad, but if we read Conrad backward via the prism of this Dialectic of Enlightenment argument, we can see that Conrad is actually, in fact, tapping into the same sorts of anxieties, the same sorts of problems, and is even anticipating something called modern genocide. Now, you could say genocide's been around for a long time, but not on the modern industrial scale that is beginning to emerge. And I think one of the, arguably, when you read that Grove of Death scene that I'm building my way up to and that we will read together, it's really reminiscent of something that's very much on the minds of Adorno and Horkheimer, and that's something called the Holocaust. So in 1944, these German writers have left Germany, and they're part of what's called the Frankfurt School of Social Science or Social Research in Germany, but they've had to relocate because of the war. And they've relocated to California, and it's during this period, this particularly dark period, that they've written this book called Dialectic of Enlightenment, in which they argue that enlightenment, a la the French version of enlightenment, all sweetness and light, the goddess of reason standing there shining her light on all subjects of interest, the human subject, is really a two-edged story. And we've been seeing some of that story, right? We saw how Paine reacts to the French Revolution. We know via his attack on Burke how Burke saw the French Revolution. We know that Paine has a lot of very negative things to say about Burke. We also know that historically, in many senses, Burke is right. It's just going to take a couple of years to prove it, because the French Revolution very quickly devolves into something called the Terror, just as the Russian Revolution very quickly devolves into a kind of terror of its own. And just as events in Germany during the Second World War manifest themselves in the Holocaust, a genocide on an industrial scale, pursued using modern industrial means. And that's what this text, Dialectic of Enlightenment, is about. It's basically looking at this problem. Looking at the problem that technology has dual uses. You're all familiar with that. You know that the magnetic resonance imaging machines that sit in the UBC hospital are also connected to the birth of the atomic bomb. Right? We know about dual-use technologies. Right? We know that the technology itself is morally neutral, but what we do with it is not so. Right? And one of the phenomena that Adorno and Horkheimer look at is the problem of, if you think of the problem of the Holocaust, from Hitler's perspective, it was purely a commercial problem. To quote Hitler, which I wouldn't normally do, an industrial problem to be resolved by industrial means. So when the Nazi state went about trying to liquidate as many Jews as possible, it was really just a kind of an efficiency problem. And they actually, for construction of the gas ovens at Holocaust, was put out to tender. You know, just the way that you would undertake any commercial enterprise. You put it up for bid. Right? And the chemicals that were used to kill people in the gas ovens were provided by a company called IG Farben, a German chemical company. They produced a very efficient gas called Zyklon B. The IG Farben company was implicated in the 1980s in supplying chemicals to the Libyan regime, to the regime of Gaddafi. That company has only recently gone out of business. So, an industrial problem. Obviously a moral problem, but also in some ways an industrial problem. So the problem that Adorno and Horkheimer are looking at in this really quite complicated book that can be simplified is that reason can lead to some fairly unanticipated and unpleasant outcomes. And I think this is part of what captures the modernist spirit as well. Just to give you a little sense of the argument. The school of philosophy that they found is called critical theory, and critical theorists would argue that there are three types of theory. There are three ways of knowing, to be more precise. There are three ways of knowing about the world. There's a way of knowing about the world that is related to understanding. So we pick up the Bible, we interpret it, we think we understand it. That's called hermeneutics. You don't need to write that down. So we can look at a text closely and understand it. But that's all we're trying to do. We're just trying to understand. We're not trying to change anything. Then there's another mode of theory or understanding that they call emancipatory. Right? That would be Marx. Marx is impatient with the idea of understanding. Marx, in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach, says, up till this point, philosophers have sought to understand the world. The point is to change it. We want to change the world. Okay, great. Wonderful. And because the critical school philosophers are Marxists, they're very much indebted to this notion of change, right? That they want to change the world. We should want to change the world. But what happens if the changes that we inaugurate are worse? So I think the question that emerges as a result of this way of thinking about the world from this very modernist perspective is who will save us from the people that purport to want to save us? So what happens when the revolutionaries who stormed the Bastille come for me next week? What happens when the Bolsheviks turn their attentions on me as a counter-revolutionary? Who will save us from the people that say they will save us? So in other words, there needs to be a third type of theory. They call that critical theory. A theory that reflects on itself so that we don't we don't make the mistake as human beings of ever assuming we've reached a sort of end point in terms of knowledge, because that can be dangerous. We always want to have a sense that there's no kind of final resting point, and therefore we need theories that are critical. So that's where the Frankfurt School philosophers are coming from. But it's really their comments about technology and reason and progress as a double-edged sword that resonate most with Conrad. And I want to show you how that works. And what I mean by that is that, again, it's this notion of dual-use technologies, that the same thing that can lead to great advances in telecommunications and transportation can also kill us. That the same things that can lead to great medical advances can destroy the whole planet. Right? That the efficiencies in bookkeeping created by the IBM company of America can be used to round up Jews during the Holocaust. In fact, IBM did that. IBM was complicit in the Holocaust. If you look at any of these events, you'll find multinational corporations complicit. How do I know that? Because IBM admitted it. Because about 15 years ago, somebody wrote a book saying, hey, IBM did this. They created data retrieval systems for the Nazis to use, and IBM said, yeah, we did. We'll just admit it now, because that book's going to press, right? So, again, really just an industrial problem to be solved by industrial means. So look how problems like as profoundly powerful as this can, in fact, just emerge almost normally as a kind of normal process. And that's what they mean when they say that this thing we call the Enlightenment is dialectical. It can cut in two different directions. So the application of reason doesn't always lead to progress. You already knew that. You've read Rousseau, right? He's kind of an early version of this type of pessimism. And so things like imperialism and genocide can be a product of this technical rationality. So if the only kind of rationality that we focus on, says Adorno and Horkheimer, is the technical variety, and we don't have critical theory, we're always going to be in danger of doing something morally reprehensible. Once we start to look at problems as merely problems of social policy, right, or as industrial problems to be solved by industrial means, then we've got a serious problem. And has Kurtz kind of gone in that direction? Or is the world that has created Kurtz, is it this kind of a world that's focused only on sort of technical rationality that's kind of created a Kurtz, if you will? And I think Conrad anticipates this in his Heart of Darkness, and I think he sort of prefigures it. I mean, that's the argument I would like to make in any case. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, well, Adorno and Horkheimer say that there's more than one kind of reason. There's more than one kind of rationality. And they want to say that if you think of reason always, and this is why they want to say that reason doesn't always necessarily lead to good outcomes, because the types of rationality that we engage in social policy institutes, for example, which is where they're coming from, is how do we solve a problem? So we've got Hitler's regime trying to solve a problem. The problem is, can we kill more Jews? Because we're not killing them as efficiently as we would like. So that's a problem of technical rationality, right? It's really kind of a policy problem. And they're saying that this version of rationality is starting to dominate. This is a very pessimistic book. I mean, it's a root and branch attack on Western reason is what it is. And they're saying that this type of reasoning, this type of thinking is beginning to dominate all other types of reason. And that, therefore, we need to sort of put the brakes on this and understand, coming out of the ashes of the Second World War, that we've got to be way more careful. And one of the things that they want to rescue, of course, because they're Marxist writers, is the promise of emancipation that Marxist theories had delivered up to then. But then things go badly wrong. Because Stalin is a problem as well, right? That's another one of those revolutions gone awry. Does that make sense? So it's just recognizing that there's more to life than just merely technical problems. And really, imperialism is a kind of a technical problem. How do we enslave, or how do we control and bring more of these factors of production into the system they're trying to create? And of course, there's genocide kicking around in this text as well, which is why I say it prefigures the Holocaust. But before we go there, let's look at aspects of this world that could be called absurd. Now, what is the absurd? It's a state or condition in which man exists or people exist in an irrational and meaningless universe. Okay, Webster's needs to update their language. That should say people. A state or condition in which people exist in an irrational and meaningless universe, and in which our existence has no meaning outside of a person's life has no meaning outside of their existence. Now, I would argue that there are a lot of absurd elements in this text, and we'll look at them in a second. And again, this is going to have implications for the way the story is told. Nothing seems to be certain anymore. So we're moving around in this. We've got a couple of forces converging at the same time, right? We've got this kind of technical rationality that's driving imperialism, but we've also got this kind of moral anarchy where nothing seems to be true anymore. And this is a kind of perfect storm for somebody like a Kurtz. Now let's look at what the absurd looks like. If you turn to page 80 of your text, you'll see what I would call some of the more bizarre features of the story that are being commented upon by Marlowe as he tells his story. So at the bottom of page 80, he says, "Once, I remember, we came upon a man of war anchored off the coast. There wasn't even a shed there, and she was shelling the bush. It appears the French had one of their wars going on thereabouts. Doesn't like the French or the Belgians. Her ensign dropped limp like a rag. The muzzles of the long six-inch guns stuck out all over the low hull. The greasy, slimy swell swung her up lazily, and let her down, swaying her thin masts. In the empty immensity of earth, sky, and water, there she was, incomprehensible, firing into a continent." Absurd. Pop would go one gun, etc., etc. So there's one example. If you turn to page 82. At long last, we reached an open rocky cliff, mounds of turned up earth by the shore, houses on a hill, others with iron roofs amongst the waste of excavations or hanging to the declivity. A continuous noise of the rapids above hovered over the scene of inhabited devastation. A lot of people, mostly black and naked, moved about like ants. Then further down, a horn tooted to the right, and I saw the black people run. A heavy and dull detonation shook the ground. A puff of smoke came out of the cliff, and that was all. No change appeared on the face of the rock. They were building a railway. The cliff was not even in the way or anything, but this objectless blasting was all the work that was going on. Sounds like Richmond Public Works. I've seen a few projects like that in the last few weeks, where one wonders what they're doing. But anyway, this is more akin to this notion of the absurd. On page 84, he's walking. I avoided a vast artificial hole somebody had been digging on the slope, the purpose for which I found impossible to divine. It wasn't a quarry or a sandpit anyhow. It was just a hole. It might have been connected with the philanthropic desire of giving the criminals something to do. I don't know. All right, so again, it's a sense of which, nobody seems to know why anybody's doing anything here. And then on page 85, bottom of page 85, I shook hands. He's talking about the company's accountant. I shook hands with this miracle, and I learned that he was the company's chief accountant and that all the bookkeeping was done at the station. He had come out for a moment, and he said to get a breath of fresh air. The expression sounded wonderfully odd with its suggestion of sedentary desk life. I wouldn't have mentioned the fellow to you at all, only it was from his lips that I first heard the name of Kurtz, and so on. And it goes on and on and on. Page 93, our last example. We've got the brickmaker making his bricks. Very unsavory character, the brickmaker. It's the middle of the page. The business entrusted to this fellow was the making of bricks. So I have been informed, but there wasn't a fragment of a brick anywhere in the station. And he had been there for more than a year, waiting, it seems. He could not make bricks without something, I don't know what, straw maybe? Anyways, it could not be found anywhere. It could not be found there, and it was not likely to be sent from Europe. It did not appear clear to me what he was waiting for. Waiting for Godot. Does not appear clear to me what he's waiting for. Another great piece of modernist writing. A play in which nothing happens twice, a critic once famously said. An act of special creation, perhaps. So, it's not difficult to detect elements of this kind of notion of absurdity, right, throughout the text. Things are being done. If there's a character in a novel by Camus called The Plague who spends his life in bed. And he's got two bowls, right? And there are peas in one bowl and nothing in the other. And then he moves all the peas from one bowl to the other. And then once that bowl's full, he moves them back again. One has a sense of that's what's going on here. That in terms of ordinary working people, nobody seems to know what anybody's doing. Now, here's an example of the absurd from the movie Apocalypse Now, which I'm not going to probably have a chance to show. Now, if I end early, there's a DVD player here. I might have a go at showing this scene. It's a 2 or 3 minute clip from the movie simply called Colonel Kilgore Goes Surfing. And if you type that into YouTube, you'll find it. And you'll see what happens is that this character played by Robert Duvall decides to go surfing right in the middle of a battle. And it's one of the more incredible scenes, I think, in an incredible movie. So just refer that to you. Now, so we've got this morally ambiguous world. Nothing is clear. The stories that Marlowe tells are inconclusive. Is there a God? Is meaning something we construct? Do we have to make, does existence precede essence, if you want to put it in existential terms? Are things absurd? Does any of it make sense? We've got this rationality kind of kicking around here. We're becoming more and more efficient at doing things, but what is it that we're doing? And are we doing it for the right reasons? So we get this sense of some kind of sense of civilizing mission. We get some sense of a noble cause, a glorious affair. It all sounds so high and mighty, but the reality is, do we really know what this is all about? Are we improving the lives of anybody? We can't even make bricks. We've got a brickmaker who's sitting here for a year and can't make bricks. And of course, we've got Marlowe himself. What does Marlowe need more than anything else? Something very mundane and ordinary, but he can't get it. What is Marlowe's problem? What does he need? Starts with an R. Yeah, he needs rivets. He can't even get rivets. He just needs some rivets to fix his boat, and he can't even get those. So it's a kind of weird world. But most of us, most people, ordinary people like Marlowe, I guess, just kind of muddle through life and just get by. And then we get a character like Kurtz who goes off the deep end, possibly off the deep end. Who knows? It's ambiguous. Maybe he's a hero. I don't think Marlowe can decide. In the movie Apocalypse Now, this incredible performance by Marlon Brando. I don't think it's ever entirely clear if Kurtz is a kind of a heroic figure. I think the movie really plays up the possibility that he is the way he is because of the opposition of the Vietnamese and the way they behave. But you'll have to decide for yourself. At one point in the text, we are told by Marlowe, who's a kind of a philosopher, a kind of resigned philosopher, who says the earth for us is a place to live in. We just kind of get by. He says in other places, he said, here are some of the things that Marlowe says that makes me think of a kind of philosopher of consolation. He's just consoling us. Strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. So life is kind of contingent. We live as we dream, he says, alone, in a very powerful passage on page 97 where he's talking about speech. It begins with him saying, and remember, he's a storyteller, and he suddenly says to the people that are listening to the story, that is to say, you, the reader, this might be Conrad speaking to you, the reader, it seems to me that I'm trying to tell you a dream. And we're now beginning to wonder if we can even communicate with one another in this world. You know, he tells us it's impossible to recreate this story the way I would like to, so that you can understand it and see Kurtz standing there. So there's a sense in which there's always going to be a distance, there's always going to be a disconnect between the storyteller and the listener, between maybe the reader and the author. We live as we dream alone, says Marlowe. Very powerful passage which you can obviously read on your own. So in a sense we make our own meaning, which is another way of saying life is absurd, but we deal with it as best we can. And this seems to be the case. This seems to be what Charlie Marlowe is telling us he does. And there's also a sense that maybe our devotion to our work, good old Protestant work ethic, maybe in devoting ourselves to our work, we can save ourselves from the darkness. If darkness is absurdity, if darkness is meaninglessness, maybe we can avoid it simply by dedicating ourselves to the task at hand. You know, how many times have we said, look, just put yourself into your work and forget about it. Move on. Pick up the pieces and move on. And so Marlowe tells us at one point that what saves us is efficiency, the devotion to efficiency. You know, the Holocaust was run quite efficiently, right? Efficiency. The trains ran on time as they entered Auschwitz. So, again, on the one hand, it looks like efficiency might be the answer. We're starting to get the impression it could also be part of the problem, right, as we'll see. And we're moving toward that. We're moving down in the novel now. We're moving figuratively down into the Grove of Death. We're moving down into Dante's Inferno. And in that part of the novel, it's brought up very clearly. So we can create a reality through our work. Look at the examples. You can look at these examples on your own, page 85 to 86. We've got this accountant in the middle of Africa who's still getting his shirts laundered and starched, and is absolutely obsessed with efficiency. He's absolutely obsessed with accounting accuracy, even though there were no bricks, there were no rivets, there were holes being dug, the continent is being shelled. All of this stuff is bizarre, but we've got somebody here who's obsessed with acting as if he were sitting in an office in Belgium. We've got this book by a guy named Towson, who, is a very precise kind of manual for the mariner, right? And there's a description of that connects up with this idea. There's Marlowe's comments on life and work on page 99. Let's look at those comments. To me, this is one of my favorite parts of the novel, because I really think it tells us a lot about Charlie Marlowe. Right in the middle of the page, he's talking about life and work and how he just gets on with his life. He's talking about the ship. He's got a special relationship with the ship. There's some interesting stuff going on in terms of gender and the female in here. Charlie Marlowe's girlfriend is a ship. She rang under my feet like an empty Huntley and Palmer biscuit tin, kicked along a gutter. She was nothing so solid in make and rather less pretty in shape, but I had expended enough hard work on her to make me love her. No influential friend could have served me better. That's a reference to his aunt in Belgium who has got him the posting that he's got. She had given me a chance to come out a bit. He's talking about a boat here, not a girlfriend, right? I'm being ironic. She had given me a chance to come out a bit, to find out what I could do. No, I don't like work. No, I don't like work. Nobody likes work. I'd rather laze about and think of all the fine things that can be done. I don't like work. No man does. But I like what is in the work. The chance to find yourself, your own reality for yourself, not for others, what no other man can ever know. So there's a sense here in which Marlowe will always be isolated from all other men. And that Kurtz will always be, we will always, in a sense, only have our own realities. So again, the sense of disconnectedness even goes to interpersonal relationships. I have a sense of who I am, but no other man can ever know that. They can only ever see the mere show and can never tell what it really means. Okay, so this raises some interesting possibilities about meaning and life and storytelling, but it also is part of this sense in which, meaning in life is connected very closely to work, my task, and I just get on with the job. Who am I, Charlie Marlowe? I'm just an ordinary guy who's been sent up this river to find this guy named Kurtz. It's not up to me, ultimately, to decide whether he did right or wrong. I'm just doing my job. Just doing my job. Just following orders. Sound familiar? So in a way, Conrad, on one level, we could say that Conrad is portraying Marlowe as a kind of hero, a kind of anti-hero hero, a kind of everyman, an ordinary Joe, a seaman who sails the world and really doesn't have any strong opinions one way or the other. Just gets on with his job, does as he's told, fixes his boat, sees people being beaten, sees people being murdered, sees people starving to death, is morally indignant about it, but ultimately he can't control any of that. He just gets on with his job, as we said on page 99, which for some reason I've listed twice. Now, Kurtz stands out as an extreme. Kurtz is an outlier. He's gone native. He's done something. He's gone beyond the pale. He's transgressed. We don't know how, we don't know what, but we know he's transgressed in some way. He's engaged in quote-unquote unspeakable rights, right, by his own admission. But generally speaking, most of us aren't like that. So we have a sense in the novel that people are divided between these extremes. Between people like Kurtz, who yield to the darkness, and then the idiots that don't even feel the darkness, and then most of us in between. Right? We're told in the text, for example, that some people are too dull to even know that they're being assaulted by the powers of darkness. Page 123, 124. But most of us are somewhere in between the extremes of the idiots and the great men, quote-unquote great man, ambiguous Kurtz. So at one extreme we've got the manager, who's a kind of a hollow man. And this is where I think Eliot gets the inspiration for the title of his poem, The Hollow Man, because we're told the manager is a hollow man, and there are hollow men kicking around in this text. A papier-mâché Mephistopheles, that links us up very nicely to Faustus. Right? But papier-mâché is what? You know what that is, right? It's hollow. So we've got a hollow man who's really a paper man, a straw man, if you will, who's got really no convictions and no sense of anything at one extreme and doesn't even realize that they're involved in anything. They don't even realize they're being assaulted by the powers of darkness, says Marlowe. And at the other extreme, we've got Kurtz, who appears to be aware of the darkness, but to yield to it. Now we have this description on page 90 of the manager. He has served 3 terms out there, because triumphant health and the general rout of constitution is a kind of power in itself. In other words, he's not morally upright. He just happens to have good health, right? He hasn't become diseased like many other people. He originated nothing. He could keep the routine going. That's it. That's all. But he was great. Ironic deflation doesn't mean great. He was great by this little thing, that it was impossible to tell what could control such a man. He never gave that secret away. Perhaps there was nothing within him. He's hollow. Such a suspicion made one pause. For out there were no external checks. Now, this is quite ominous. Out there are no external checks. There's nothing to keep somebody under control. Right? And this is the problem that we have with Kurtz. As I said earlier, of course, somebody may be too much of a fool to go wrong, too dull to even know they're being assaulted by the powers of darkness. I take it no fool ever made a bargain for his soul with the devil. Right? Now, what about the possibility that Marlowe is kind of the hero of this text? There are some sympathetic aspects to Marlowe, for sure. I mean, for one thing, he's sailed the world. He's very experienced. We're told, when we read the text, that he's a kind of citizen of everywhere and nowhere, because his home is the sea. He doesn't really even set foot. I mean, he sets foot on land, but he's more comfortable at sea. So he's kind of an everyman. He's somebody that we can all identify with. We have him commenting on these pilgrims walking around building fences in the middle of nowhere. It's like trying to build, I don't know, it's like trying to build a residential neighborhood in the middle of the desert. I think that's called Phoenix. But forget I said that. So we've got this sense in which he's looking at, we look at a map of Africa, we saw these lines. I think from Marlowe's perspective, there's something arbitrary about all this. We're creating all these kinds of divisions between humanity. I think Marlowe really sees one humanity, one human race. And I think he sees Africans as savage and incomprehensible, but he also sees himself as connected to them. He also believes, I think, in one overarching humanity. And he also sees himself as connected to Kurtz. So he's accepting kinship with every human being, including the Africans and the extreme of Kurtz. So in that sense, we could say, well, that's pretty, maybe he's a kind of a hero, a kind of a deflated hero. Not a hero in the Superman sense, but somebody who's somebody that we can identify with. Just an ordinary person. Good old Charlie Marlowe. But is it possible, and this is just a suggestion, you don't have to accept this, is it possible that Kurtz is really a kind of a red herring? That we focus on a Kurtz, a powerful guy, a guy with probably a very bright guy who went bad. Probably somebody with a large soul individual, as they used to say in Victorian times, right? Somebody with a really powerful personality who goes bad and yields to the forces of darkness. Kind of like Moriarty in Sherlock Holmes. A worthy rival to Sherlock, only he's gone in the opposite direction. Is Kurtz like that? Well, okay, so he's compelling in that sense. But is it also a bit of a distraction from the reality that it's really Charlie Marlowe himself and people like him that are the problem? That when he enters the grove of death and sees this guy dying, is it possible that Marlowe and people like him are themselves the biggest part of the problem? That they've created this problem, that they've created Kurtz, that they're the ones that are carrying the seeds and germs of empire, that they're the ones that are carrying the diseases into the countries that they're, and of course, also yielding to the diseases as they move around the world. Is that possible? Is that one way of reading the text? So we've got any colonizing mission and any genocide needs its bit players, right? It needs to be sustained. The German Holocaust, or if you will, the Nazi Holocaust, to be more precise and less controversial, it needed its infrastructure. It needed its IG Farbens. It needed its industrial policy. And does this colonizing mission and the genocide to which it probably unwittingly creates, it needed its colonial flunkies, it needed its bankers, it needed its brickmakers, its accountants, it needed its Charlie Marlows, it needed its managers, it needed people that were just ordinary people who could say, I'm just doing my job. I'm doing my job in isolation from everything else, but the end sum total is that I'm contributing to this problem. So that when when Bergen-Belsen and the death camps were liberated, people that lived in the towns close by could say, we didn't know what was happening. We just got on with our lives. Or I'm just an ordinary person doing my ordinary thing. But maybe I'm directly contributing to this, but really not aware that it's happening or not wanting to be aware that it's happening. And those that were aware that it was happening, well, I was just following orders. I was told I had to do that. Right? The way that the brickmaker is following his orders, the way that Charlie Marlowe is following his orders. Are these the hollow men? Are these, as I like to put it, are they genocidal nerds? We're told, after all, that all of Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz. Well, what does that mean? It must mean something. That Kurtz isn't just a problem in isolation. He's our problem, that we created this thing. And part of how we create is we believe in lies, like the Congo Free State. This is a complete lie. It's not a free state. And the Democratic Republic of Congo, as it's called today, continues to be a lie. And one of the biggest lies of all time is this lie, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. Where did this statement happen to be posted? Right above the gates of Auschwitz. As one entered the gates of Auschwitz, they read, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. It's a notorious, infamous lie. It's a death camp. And this novel takes us into a death camp. If we could turn to page 83 of the text, this is probably the most powerful part of the novel. And some commentators have said, reading it backward, eerily reminiscent of what the British, American, and Russian liberators found as they entered the death camps. We start on page 83, toward the bottom of the page. I've seen the devil of violence and the devil of greed and the devil of hot desire, but by all the stars, these were strong, lusty, red-eyed devils that swayed and drove men. Men, I tell you. But of that land I would become acquainted with a flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil of a rapacious and pitiless folly. How insidious he could be, too, I was only to find out several months later, and 1,000 miles farther. For a moment I stood appalled, as though by warning. Finally I descended the hill. We have this notion of a descent, okay? He's coming down. He's coming down from the world of light into the world of darkness, in a sense. He's descending into hell. Okay? He's descending into something like we have a sense, a literal and a figurative sense of going down. Finally, I descended the hill obliquely toward the trees I had seen. I avoided a vast artificial hillside. We just talked about that. At last I got under the trees. My purpose was to stroll into the shade for a moment. But no sooner within than it seemed to me I had stepped into the gloomy circle of some inferno. The rapids were near, and an uninterrupted, uniform, headlong, I need new glasses, rushing noise filled the mournful silence of the grove, where not a breath stirred, not a leaf moved with a mysterious sound, as though the tearing pace of the launched earth had suddenly become audible. Black shapes crouched, sat between the trees, leaning half against trunks, clinging to the earth, half coming out, half effaced with the dim light. Notice how the light has now become dim. In all the attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair, another mine on the cliff went off. This pointless work is going on in the background, followed by a slight shudder of the soil under my feet. The work was going on. The work. And this was the place where some of the helpers had withdrawn to die. They were dying slowly, it was clear. They were not enemies. They were not criminals. They were nothing earthly now. Nothing but black shapes of disease and starvation lying confusedly in the greenish gloom. Brought from all the recesses of the coast and all the legality of time contracts, lost in uncongenial surroundings, fed on unfamiliar food, they sickened, became inefficient, and were allowed then to crawl away and rest. They're really crawling away to die. These moribund shapes were free as air and nearly as thin. I began to distinguish the gleams of the eyes under the trees. Then, glancing down, I saw a face near my hand. The black bones reclined at full length, with one shoulder against the tree, and slowly the eyelids rose, and the sunken eyes looked up at me, enormous and vacant, a kind of blind white flicker in the depths of the orbs, which died out slowly. The man seemed young, almost a boy, but you know it's hard to tell with them. So there's his kind of garden variety standard Victorian racism coming out. Maybe not the kind that Achebe accuses him of, but nevertheless. I found nothing else to do but to offer him one of my good Swedes ship biscuits. I had it in my pocket. The fingers closed slowly on it and held. There was no other movement and no other glance. He had a tied bit of white worsted as fabric around his neck. Why? Where did he get it from? Was it a badge, an ornament, a charm, a propitiatory act? Was there any idea at all connected with it? It looked startling around his black neck, this bit of white thread from beyond the seas. Now, I think it's interesting that he's got a bit of white thread from beyond the seas tied around his neck because it's linking him back to industry. It's linking him back to textile manufacturers in the European world. And I think that connection is deliberate. So here we have this not only do we have this really powerful situation, or what we might call genocide, there's also a sense in which there's something kind of unprecedented about this. It's on a scale that has not really existed before, and there's a consciousness about it. And maybe the thing that's most powerful about all this is that it's come about just because we did our jobs, right? That we put our shoulder to the grindstone and did our jobs, right? We were just being efficient. We were just doing what we were told to do. So maybe, you know, when we emphasize Kurtz as much as we do, we shouldn't forget the complicity of others, the complicity of Marlowe, the complicity of bookkeepers and all those people that make an empire run, who really just ordinary people and sort of escape our gaze, so to speak. I think we're at the end and have maybe 2 minutes left. Yes, we are at the end. Okay, so any questions or comments in the unprecedented minute and a half that remains? There isn't enough time to try and show the scene from Apocalypse Now, but if you go to YouTube and look for Colonel Kilgore Goes Surfing, you'll see it. And provisions will be made to show the film, and I don't know what they are. Did you? Okay. That I don't know. That I don't know. I can look for you. Okay. All right. I guess we're done. Thanks.